Ladies and gentlemen, can I again thank the Gummidge clan of the Yolngu people for the inspiration they provide annually. A reminder that the world's oldest living cultures are indeed living and will live on in the future. I'm having a common experience to the one I had yesterday. I'm completely discombobulated. For a start, I came along expecting the same old argument between my two colleagues, and instead I had to sit through an attack on the West Australian government of the sort that I'm really feeling quite uncomfortable about, Bob. So this, without warning, I came along unprepared, but and I'm completely ignorant, so I can respond with confidence. There are only a couple of things I really want to say about Bob's, I think, justifiable concerns about the issue of the capital gains, the GST redistribution. It has very large implications for the Northern Territory, as indeed it has for my state. The additional point that I would make is this. The Grants Commission system has been in existence for a very long time, I think since, the 1930s? Very long time. It long predates the GST. It was a nation-building idea, and the idea has been described accurately by Bob. The states are uneven in their financial capacity. We want to have an Australia where there is a reasonable provision, a reasonable capacity in each of those elements, the states and the territories, to deliver a certain standard of public services. That's been a unifying notion. I think there was a bit of shallow thinking, however, when the dramatic introduction of the GST recast the Australian tax system. I want to go back to what the GST was for. The GST was to provide the states with their own growth tax. The complaint of the states was that the growth taxes were all in the hands of the Commonwealth, income tax and company tax in particular. And so we, the poor old states, and I'm a whinging states writer for one, so that's fine, we, the poor old states, didn't have a decent access to decent growth taxes, which meant that we could grow our revenues to meet health, education and other services. The sleight of hand that I think that's been involved is that, of course, the Commonwealth Grants Commission allocated balancing funds out of Commonwealth revenue. So the states weren't affected in that sense. They simply received greater or lesser amounts from the Commonwealth according to that formula. By loading that into into the new tax, the state's growth tax is essentially denuded in the case of Western Australia. It's got not a growth tax, but a diminishing tax. And I mean, the imbalances that Bob showed are pretty sharp. To go from over $5 in every dollar collected in the Northern Territory to 30 cents in every dollar collected in Western Australia is a very severe impost on the state. Bob was quite correct in saying that during the good years, the government of Western Australia built up its recurrent expenditure pattern. You're quite accurate in saying that. We have some of the best paid police, nurses, teachers, etc. in Australia, doctors. My son works in the public health service, and if there are no media here, I can say he thinks they're all grossly overpaid. So that is a problem that the WA has created for itself, but I don't think that anyone ever envisaged that the share of GST would drop to 30 cents. The huge political problem is that if West Australia gets an adjustment, the adjustment has to come from somewhere. In my view, the truly principal political solution would be to take the redistribution of funds under the Grants Commission out of the GST pool, which is meant to be a growth tax for the states, and deal with it in a different way. The only other thing I want to say about Bob's presentation is this. I think there is an explanation for the ballooning Aboriginal population in some parts of Australia other than that people are trying to get on the gravy train. The fact of the matter is that my understanding is that more than 60% of Aboriginal people marry non-Aboriginal people. If you think about that, that means an increasing proportion of people who regard themselves as Aboriginal have an Aboriginal parent. And so I think just as a matter of mathematics, there's necessarily a very large number of people who may well have a very strongly committed Aboriginal parent who wants them to remain part of that pattern. So I think there's sure to be 1 million different stories, well, 500,000 different stories. I don't think there's a single truth here, but I think it would be a pity to think that the increasing numbers of Aboriginal people in the more settled parts of Australia don't reflect the ongoing pride in the Aboriginality of those people who marry non-Aboriginals and who bring up their children wanting them to continue to be part of that. I work with many people who proudly say, and I'm happy that they do, I've got German inheritance, I've got English inheritance, I've got Irish inheritance, and I have Aboriginal inheritance. There are genuine policy questions about what that means in terms of Aboriginal directed programs. I understand that, but I think it's really important that we follow the Makarrata principles as espoused by the great leader of this place, and that we carefully and respectfully consider these things in a way which is not offensive. Remember the people who were accused of being self-seeking, self-labelling Aboriginal people in a way which they, I think, led them to sue. Some of those people I knew, and I never thought that they were claiming to be recognised as Aboriginal people just as a matter of profit. If I could turn now to Barry's point and the dispute that has gone on for several Garmas now between these two worthy people, both of whom are of the quality of people that I was lucky enough to have advice from as a minister. Ministers have quite a difficult life, and they are utterly reliant on having good advice from public servants and from outsiders. I happen to have had the good fortune to have had Bob as one of my advisors as a Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. He and his colleagues I cannot fault for their professionalism, their attention to the facts and their knowledge. I've also drawn on people like you. In the current debates about CDP, which you heard, some of you heard aired with the Minister announcing great changes just yesterday from this place, the sort of work that Barry has done was done by scholars, some from the ANU, who have brought out the facts, disclosed the fact that there are significant issues for Aboriginal people under the administration of that program, facts which, in conversations with PM&C, I've heard hotly denied, but which now I think are accepted by the department and by the Minister, and hence his view that he needs to change the program. I guess I'm just wanting to pay tribute to both of my co-panellists for the sort of work they do in trying to enable us to proceed on the basis of fact. The reason I've tended to fall into my colleague Barry Hanson's camp is not because I doubt the intellectual capacity or the honesty of Bob Beedman, but simply because of the evidence of my eyes. I think Darwin is a wonderful city. It's modern, well appointed. It's a place where people I know go for holidays or to retire. It's a wonderful environment. As I move around other parts of the territory, and I must confess in the last couple of years I haven't had much of that opportunity, I see some very unhappy places. Bob made a perfectly accurate point that you can't expect to have a great big hospital and a great big university and a whole lot of other things in every small settlement. That's absolutely true, of course. But the fact of the matter is there is too much squalor. Too much squalor in some of the communities of the Northern Territory, and to sit them alongside Darwin is to be reminded of how unfair the circumstances of too many people are. Whatever the fine detail of that, I would say that on the evidence of my own eyes, that there has been a strong need to focus more of the resources of the territory into the smaller communities, which are, as I said, too often rather squalid. The other point I want to touch is this, and the topic, can I just have my... topic of this discussion. Topics of discussions have not always been a good guide to what's being talked about, we've noticed over the last couple of days, but in this case, government grants and money. So I want to mention something which is very close to my heart and to which I've been giving much more recent attention. My comments are necessarily informed by my experience in Western Australia, in the remote communities along the South Australian Northern Territory border, remote communities to the east of the great mining areas of the Pilbara, and remote communities within the centre of the desert around Wiluna. What has struck me continuously in dealing with those communities is that there is basically no framework of public administration. If I can talk about the Nunajara lands, which I first visited in 1979 and found in chaos. It was an ex-mission. People had been gathered together from all over the country. They were angry, they were violent, they were unhappy. And to the great credit of Department of Aboriginal Affairs, Chris Marshall was assigned to go out there at my request to find the best possible person. And that began a process of reorganisation and growth, which I think has been a splendid example of Aboriginal people doing for themselves and constructing a new future for themselves. They decentralised into a number of communities. The core community is Warburton. They have substantial physical assets now in Warburton. They have substantial capacity in Warburton. According to the Australian newspaper, they are the second largest Aboriginal trading corporation in Australia. They have to be regarded as some sort of success in that they've been largely scandal-free for a quarter of a century and managing themselves in a way which I think has been admirable. When you see from where they've come to where they've got to, it is a powerful story of human endurance, courage and skill. Are they in good shape? No. No, they're not. For a whole period of years now, the basic programs, and bear in mind that the economies in these places are essentially determined by government, they've done the large trading operations. They have, for example, a capacity to service things. They did $1.3 million worth of contracting in supporting buildings of the Education Department last year, to the complete satisfaction of the Education Department. They've had a tradition of managing their housing maintenance and so on. They're being undercut in so many ways. The fundamental administrative structure in those communities was supported by two things, CDEP and municipal services funding. This enabled them to maintain a framework of administration that permitted the orderly administration of those communities. The abolition of CDEP some years ago, the replacement by a dysfunctional, admitted now by the proponents, a dysfunctional large ACP, destroyed much of the fabric of a community which had, in a community basis, entered into voluntary income management, which ensured that all rents were paid, electricity was paid, funerals were paid. They even had a superannuation fund for CDP workers. There was a stability there which came from permissive funding. Today there is no program for funding the basic administration of these remote communities. To maintain any administration at all, they must cannibalise programs that are available to them. And this is one of the reasons why many desert communities, in my view, have gone backwards over recent years. I think until governments define quite clearly what they believe the future of these communities will be and their entitlement to exist, we're going to go on seeing people living in more degraded circumstances rather than improving circumstances. I think there's a huge gap in this area of funding. I think that those of you who are involved in NGOs will know the problem. Nobody wants to fund the administrative infrastructure of an NGO. Nobody. What they want to do is to fund your programs. Well, the Commonwealth may fund programs, but the basic administrative underpinning that keeps a community alive has to be funded too. I can tell you that in the communities I know well, the servants of those communities who are honest, decent people spend their life trying to link up with Centrelink on the phone with long delays, long periods of misunderstanding, cards being lost, people being breached for 8 weeks at a time, I'm sorry, in those terms the funding arrangements are, in my view, entirely inadequate and wrong. It was a moment of elation for me yesterday. Some of you who were here, but I would think I might have shown that elation when Minister Scullion announced that he was going to move to a wage-based system with a right to top up. This is incredibly good news. The Minister has made a previous attempt to sort this out, which didn't succeed. I can only give him my utter good wishes in implementing it on this time. But I think there is a drastic need for the sort of analysis that both of my colleagues on this platform have done. I think it's absolutely correct that the Northern Territory Government should have as a very high priority what the impact of any GST review will be on them, because it could be quite great. I'm not prepared to say that my state of Western Australia doesn't have some case for adjustment. Indeed, I believe it does. But I think that the real problem for the states is that they have created a situation where they must cannibalise each other to get the sort of social equalisation which was supposed to be part of the contract of being part of our Commonwealth. I think that's a really sad situation where state is set against state, state is set against territory, territory is set against state, and so on. I think it's a sign of the deterioration of our politics that we can't be a little more rational about dealing with these issues.
I've been given permission for an addendum. Fred made a remark about how the tax sharing arrangements with the state was nobbled by the GST process. What I wanted to draw to everybody's attention is a need to look at total Commonwealth receipts, and the line's gone up like that. And then you look at the total revenue sharing to the states and it's gone up like that. So there's this gap here that the Commonwealth has retained for itself for own purpose outlays by way of special purposes grants to the states. So when you add those special purposes grants to the GST sharing, it looks like the state's revenues have maintained that growth line. What it doesn't tell you is that the infinite detail of conditions attached to those special purpose agreements by the Commonwealth, special purposes grants by the Commonwealth, means further Commonwealth intrusion into areas that are the constitutional responsibility of the states and leads to blame shedding and duplication.
I think that the point made by Bob is correct, by the way, and I want you to remember his graph. The state stuff going this way, the Commonwealth stuff going this way. My argument was that the redistribution should come out of this bit, that bit, not out of that bit.
I just want to make a stay there because I'm going to ask a question.